So welcome, one and all. My name is Chris Moyer, and I'm the Forest Service Liaison to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I've been in this role for a little over a year now, and I'm going to share just a little bit with you about my position and how this webinar came to be. So I am a Forest Service employee, and I split my time between the Forest Service Washington office building and the Association of Fish and Wildlife headquarters here in Washington, D.C. On the Forest Service side, I work for Rob Harper, who's the director for watershed, fish, wildlife, air, and rare plants. And on the association side, I work for Ron Reagan, who is the executive director of AFWA. My role between these two agencies is to further the very productive relationships that we already have, connect people and information, help resolve issues, and tackle new challenges. This webinar is a result of connecting people with information and tackling new challenges. In my role, I've interacted with most of the state fish and wildlife agency directors. Over the course of those conversations, it became apparent to me that within the state agencies, there was a wide range of knowledge about the Good Neighbor Authority, from the, hey, we love that, to good what? So this is just too awesome of a tool to an authority for folks not to know about it. It's just a really good way for agencies to work together. Historically, a couple years back when the Forest Service rolled out the Good Neighbor Authority, we did a really good job of reaching out to state forestry agencies. We didn't do as good a job as we could have reaching out to state fish and wildlife agencies. And in that realm, we have shared conservation objectives that really this authority allows us to move forward on. You're going to hear about Good Neighbor Authority. You're going to hear that it's being used in a lot of places in some really creative ways, and we're learning a lot about what we can do with this authority. Throughout this webinar, please use the chat box to type in your questions. We're anticipating many people joining this, and I think the best way we're going to be able to handle questions is if you can type them in. We will try to answer your questions. We have big blocks of time set aside during the course of this webinar to make sure that we get to questions, but we're not sure that we're going to get to all the questions. But please type in your questions. We're going to try and capture them the best we can. This webinar is being recorded, and it's being recorded for future viewing. I know there are a lot of people who were interested in it but have conflicts and unable to attend. So we are recording this. This is the result of a lot of hard work for many, many people, some of which you'll hear today, some of which are in the background making things work. Both the Forest Service and AFWA put a lot of time and energy into pulling this together. So thanks to everyone who lent a helping hand. And without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Lynn, who is going to take us through some of the basics of this. And I just need to figure out how to turn Lynn's line on so she can talk. So bear with me for a moment. Bear with us, we're having a bit of a technical difficulty right at the moment.
The conference is no longer in listen-only mode.
Okay, so we're going to ask everyone to mute their lines. Lynn, you are up.
Sounds good. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Hey, super. Chris, thank you so much. And thanks to AFWA for hosting this webinar today on Good Neighbor Agreements. We've got a lot of really great information on the docket today. The presenters today, I'm Lynn Schulte, and I'm a Grants and Agreements Specialist with State and Private Forestry in the Washington office. And then also presenting that you'll hear in a little bit is David Lawrence, who's a timber sales analyst in the Washington office for the Forest Service in forest management. The really cool thing we have going on today, and it sounds like somebody put us on hold, we have presenters from the Forest Service Region 1 and staff from the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that you'll hear from with the project, and also from the Forest Service Region 8 and from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission that will be joining us and telling you about some of the projects that they've done under Good Neighbor. So first off, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that while Good Neighbor is sort of the new cool tool that we have a lot of tools in the toolbox that we can use already. And I'm hoping that a lot of you are familiar with them. We have challenge cost share agreements. We have participating agreements. We can do sole source contracts under the Sykes Act if we've got an MOU in place. So we've got Good Neighbor, which is our very newest authority that we can work with our state partners. We can accomplish a very, very wide variety of work with all of these different tools. And the key is, and you're going to hear this a lot today, is when you start thinking about a project that you'd like to do with your state partner or any partner for that matter, the first thing you need to do in the Forest Service is you need to go talk to your grants and agreement specialist. And they can help you select the right tool for the job. No sense using a monkey wrench when a screwdriver would do, right? So the goal of this session today is to provide the background for Good Neighbor Authority. And here, this part that's in bold and italics is the most important piece of the Good Neighbor Act. And what it authorizes is for states to perform forest, rangeland, and watershed restoration services on national forest system lands. So keep that piece in mind, because that's really what we're going to talk about today. So how are we going to line this out? I'm taking the first stint, and we'll kind of do an overview of Good Neighbor and some of the parameters. And then we'll stop for questions, and like Chris said, get the chat box, and we'll take questions from there. Then we'll look at our first project, the Selway Meadows restoration from Montana, from Region 1. David Lawrence will take over with some current issues and updates, what we didn't know that we didn't know, and what we've learned. And then we'll take a look at the project in North Carolina, a wildlife habitat restoration project, and then we'll have another set for questions. And again, please use that chat box. We're all going to try and monitor that and answer things as best we can. So why is Good Neighbor important? What's the big deal? And we've had this question a lot. And the other question that comes along is, well, why would states care? Why would states want to do this work? Well, what Good Neighbor does is it gives us the ability to work across boundaries and treat the landscape all as one. And that's a really important thing that we need to be doing now. Fosters a collaborative approach, and it gives us the ability to leverage state resources. So it says, think economy of scale. And what we mean by that is often if one agency is contracting for a piece of work, if we can double or triple that contract by doing the work that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks say is doing in one place, and we can say, hey, let's tag on to that contract and do all this additional work for the Forest Service, well, it's one contract, and generally the prices come in lower, so we have the potential for saving some money there. So we have two authorities really for Good Neighbor, but we're only going to look at the Farm Bill Good Neighbor Authority. The other authority was given to us in the 2014 Appropriations Act, and it expires September 30th of this year. And by expiring, it means every project has to be complete, paid for, and the agreement has to be closed by September 30th. It's much more restrictive than the Farm Bill version, and so almost everything we've done under Farm Bill comes under, everything we've done under Good Neighbor comes under the Farm Bill. So this one's permanent authority, nationwide and Puerto Rico. We can enter into it with any state agency, and the appropriations version restricted us to state forestry agencies only. So under the Farm Bill, we can work with Fish and Wildlife, we can work with Forestry, we can work with Department of Ag, whichever state agency might have responsibility for the activities that we want to perform. It says adjacency is not required. And again, this is a difference between the appropriations version and the Farm Bill version. The appropriations version required that the state be performing work on lands adjacent to the National Forest System lands where the Good Neighbor activity was going to be taking place. And that's not a requirement under the Farm Bill, which again gives us much more flexibility. So then it says allowable activities include forest, rangeland, and watershed restoration services. Here it is again, right, that we just saw a couple of slides back. Now the Act itself specifically excludes construction or improvement of permanent roads, parking areas, public works. It excludes work in wilderness areas or wilderness study areas, and areas where vegetation removal is prohibited or restricted by law. So keep that in mind. That's an exclusion that's specifically in the law itself. So we've heard the forest, rangeland, and watershed restoration services. What's that mean? What it means are these activities that are specifically called out in the law again. So activities to treat insect and disease-infected trees, activities to treat hazardous fuels, and then here's the big catch-all, right? Any other activities to restore or improve forest, rangeland, and watershed health, including fish and wildlife habitat. And we're going to look at a lot of examples further on in the presentation. Oh, like right here. So what are some good examples of restoration services? Number one, fish and wildlife habitat improvement projects. We can have commercial timber removal through Good Neighbor. And we won't go into the specifics of that today, but keep in mind that that can occur. Temporary road construction. Remember, we talked permanent road construction is not allowed. Road decommissioning falls under restoration services. Project planning, emergency watershed stabilization, and tree planting and seeding. Now, unauthorized uses. Fire dispatch agreements. Think about some of these things. Hiring a state employee to fill a vacant Forest Service position. Conservation education programs. Aerial photography flights that are just the standard run-of-the-mill every 10-year flights that we do. And then there's that road construction or reconstruction. So the first four items are unauthorized activities because they don't fit under restoration services, right? They just don't fit. But again, we have other better tools in the toolbox to do that kind of work. And the last one, the road construction, is excluded again because of the Act itself. So let's talk about the agreements themselves and how things, the mechanics of them, of an agreement. You know, hopefully you're familiar with participating agreements and challenge cost share agreements. And in many ways, these Good Neighbor agreements are similar to those, but there are some other big differences that I think you'll pick up on here as we look through these parameters. The first thing is that Good Neighbor agreements are subject to the regulations in 2 CFR Part 200. Any of our partners that have worked with federal grants recognize those regulations, and so those do apply. The good neighbor agreements don't require match or competition, and that's by statute. We're not restricted by mutual interest or benefit like we have to do under our challenge, cost shares, and participating agreements. But quite honestly, if we're partnering with a Fish and Wildlife Agency to do a project, it's just implied in the relationship that we have that mutual interest and benefit to be working together. Project purpose must be consistent with the Forest Service mission and the authorized restoration services described in the Act. There that is again. Also called out in the Act is that the Forest Service retains NEPA decision-making authority. We can work with our state partners to do the NEPA documentation and the investigation, but the Forest Service retains the decision-making authority. So we use, those of you that are familiar with the federal grant program, we use an SF 425 form for financial reporting. But then what we do when we're developing the agreement is we can use our partnership type of financial plans to spell out the budget. It's a really good tool, and we can use that in these good neighbor agreements. We do allow program income from the sale of forest products from National Forest System land, and there are other presentations that cover that product removal specifically. We can allow pre-agreement costs because we're under the regulations at 2 CFR 200. Again, we negotiated and those are approved in advance. Our agreement term is for up to 10 years, which is different than our regular agreements. Also, again, related to the timber removal, the Forest Service will approve any marking guides or silvicultural prescriptions. And then this is an important one for our functioning under Good Neighbor, that our state partners can award contracts or enter into agreements with other parties using state contracting procedures. So keep in mind that the state is performing the work for the Forest Service as an agent or similar to a contractor. So if we're jointly performing the work, then we maybe need to look at another tool, a different agreement. And then lastly, we need to keep in mind along that same path that supervisory and administrative responsibilities have to remain with the state for their own employees or contractors. Okay. So how do we pay for a good neighbor agreement? How do we pay for the work that's being performed? There is no pot of special appropriated money for good neighbor. We use our regular appropriated funds, and we use the right funds for the job when we do that. We cannot use, for Forest Service people, we cannot use RAC money or retained receipts that are generated from a stewardship contract. So those can't be used for good neighbor agreements. We can use trust fund money, our KVBD and a salvage sale fund that are generated from timber sales. We can use those funds. We can use third-party contributions. So say for example, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation came in and they gave a grant to the Forest Service and said, we want to use this money for a wildlife burn, a habitat burn for elk improvement. And then we could use that money to pay the state to do the wildlife burn for us, or vice versa. What if the Elk Foundation gave the money to the state? The state could use that to pay their expenses for doing that burn on National Forest System land under a good neighbor agreement. Same thing with in-kind. You know, if there are other volunteers that may be coming to work, we can certainly accept that. The other thing we can use to pay for good neighbor agreements is program income that's generated from a sale of timber. And this is where the wildlife folks want to make sure that they are at the table talking to the timber folks when there's generation of program income, because that can be used for restoration activities on National Forest System land. So let's stop right here for some questions. And I'll dive in. I'll just read the one that just popped in here from Joni Packard. And it says, if states are doing the work, does the Forest Service still have the ability to specify the work standards to be met? For example, trail stabilization work for watershed improvement. And the answer to that is absolutely. We have a responsibility to lay out the standards. We need to be able to tell the state what the parameters are for the work that we're asking them to do. So, any other questions?
Lynn, this is Chris. There are several questions in the question tab.
Oh, I see that. And David, you're unmuted too. Let's see, questions about getting the PowerPoint. Chris, I'll let you answer that.
Yes, with respect to the PowerPoint, we'd be glad to share it with everyone. I believe we will have everyone's email if you signed in with an email, so I think we can send it out that way. We'll also distribute it through the network of various connections through AFWA and the Forest Service as the invite went out.
Okay, so how about I'm just going to go from the bottom up here. It says, would this exclusion for roads include the installation of culverts? Boy, this question comes up a lot. And the answer is our favorite grants and agreements answer is, it depends. It depends on what the purpose of the culvert installation is. If it's to fix a sagging road, the answer is no. Because remember, we can't do any work, any construction or reconstruction of permanent roads. Now, if you had to put in a culvert for fish passage or other habitat improvement, then yes, it could be considered. But it would need to be spelled out very clearly in the agreement, and you'd have to be using the appropriate type of money to pay for that. So we would use say a code that was appropriate for fisheries work, not a code that was used for road repair. So let's go up to the next question. Can you use it for flights related to insect infestations related to southern pine beetle epidemics? And the answer is yes. We have we've been talking back and forth with a lot of the regions, and this is work that has to be done specifically for to be able to do the restoration work to work with the insect and disease infected trees.
In fact, I believe national forests in Alabama are doing that very thing.
And they are in Oregon too, I believe. Let's see. Adjacency not required. A little more explanation. So it means what it meant in the appropriations version was it absolutely the state had to be performing the work. I'm just going to use weed spraying because that's such an easy example. So in order for us to enter into a good neighbor agreement under the appropriations version where adjacency is required, the state would have to be treating weeds. Say they were treating yellow star thistle on the land that was adjacent to the national forest in order for us to work with them for them to treat the yellow star thistle on the national forest system lands. So they really have to be working on both sides of the line and right next to each other. The Farm Bill Authority doesn't require that. Let's see. It says it looks like recreation management, especially where sustainable recreation work shows impacts to habitat are occurring, is allowable. I'm thinking you need to be really, really careful when we talk recreation management and how that might fit into restoration services. Now, when you talk about stabilizing trails and stopping erosion, you have to be able to make a pretty darn direct tie to restoration work if you're coming at it from the recreation standpoint. David, do you want to expand on that anymore?
No, I think you hit it there. It's kind of the similar issue of the roads, even though recreation wasn't specifically prohibited. Recreation is not a restoration activity, so it still comes back to the objectives of the activity. If you're doing it to manage recreation, that's probably not appropriate. If you're doing it to manage the natural resources and conserve or protect or rehabilitate the landscape, then it may be appropriate.
Let's see. Go ahead.
Sorry, Sharon's question there at the beginning, I think you covered this, but the Farm Bill Good Neighbor Authority applies to basically all states with national forests, and the legislation actually talks about all affected states. So theoretically, it could be a state adjacent to a state with national forest if there is some effect. We have actually had some projects where a state has taken on a project in a different state because they're adjacent.
Okay, well, let's tackle this next one from Neil. It says, can you use it to fund state positions? And we're going to, you know what, I'm going to set this one aside because we're going to talk about exactly that here in just a little bit. And the same thing with the next two questions about, and it's really about hiring. So we'll gather all of those up together and talk about it in a little bit, and then we'll come back to those questions. So I think what I'd like to do right now, because I think this is the most important and the most exciting part of this whole presentation, is I would like to turn this over to the folks from Region 1 Forest Service, from the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, and from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And with us, we've got Jim Brammer and Sharon Sawyer with the Forest Service, and then also with us, I hope, but I think muted, are Lee Nelson and Matt Yeager with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So I'm going to turn this over to you with a big thank you for your willingness to step up and put this presentation together. So it's all yours.
And so we'll just start again. So the Beaverhead Deer Lodge acquired Selway Meadows. It was about 1,200 acres of private valley bottom. We did that in 2007. The emphasis for acquisition was primarily tied to substantial aquatic and wildlife values. As soon as we purchased it, it sparked immediately public interest. It's just an exceedingly beautiful area that it has broad appeal, all the way from hunters to fishermen to hikers, campers, picnickers, wildflower watchers, a host of things. So it was an opportunity to consolidate all of this ownership into a single piece of Forest Service land that opened a lot of areas to access to people that couldn't use it prior. Historically, the Selway Meadows bottom was primarily used for summer grazing land. The owners grazed it pretty heavily. There was some impacts, substantial impacts, and a lot of the riparian overstory was gone, whether it be from people trying to remove it or drying out channels or whatever. So the area did change some. And the other thing that was present was a substantial irrigation infrastructure. between 15 to 20 diversions and about 10 miles of irrigation ditches that were essential to prior owners for increasing forage for their livestock. When we acquired it, there were a substantial amount of calls from the public to stop the irrigation diversion and to stop grazing. But the terms of acquisition for this property were tied. The only way that we had state and county support for this acquisition was if the traditional uses there continued. So when we got it, we'd had it for some time. We started a number of elements to this to try to understand the effects of this area, what the irrigation infrastructure was doing to in-stream flows in the fishery, and a host of other things. But also, we had just completed a forest plan. We'd revised it, and we believed that Selway Meadows could be used as kind of a show-me place for what the forest plan envisioned as far as integrated restoration. And the opportunities in the Selway watershed range all the way from improved livestock grazing, but continued grazing, timber production, roads and recreation. Irrigation infrastructure is a part of what we inherited, and it needs to be improved. A lot of that infrastructure was failing. Wildlife resources. There are a lot of elk, bear, there are wolves in the area, antelope, deer. So anybody, and moose, people could go out on any given day and see a host of many wildlife species. And then we have the aquatic resources that we're going to focus on this discussion a little bit today. So the opportunities for restoration of the fishery is significant. And eastern brook trout, non-native eastern brook trout, are what occupy, that's a majority of what occupies the streams. We do have some rainbow and brown trout that come in from downstream into the meadows area seasonally. So we're lacking our only native trout that should be there and that was historically there is native west-slope cutthroat trout. We also have another native species, western pearl shell mussel. These little guys are really fascinating for those of you that don't know much about them. They can live to be up to 100 years old, and they need an intermediate host, a fish species, to help them reproduce and redistribute. And west-slope cutthroat trout is their preferred immediate host. So it shouldn't surprise anyone to understand that when we started to look at this population and understand it, its distribution had shrunk dramatically, and its age structure indicated that there had just been very little reproduction over the last 20 to 30 years. Our assumption is it's because we lack west-slope cutthroat trout. So we worked really closely with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to look at the opportunity to reintroduce native cutthroat into this stream system. On our forest, most of our cutthroat populations occupy between 1 mile and 5 miles of stream. They're extremely isolated. They're threatened because of their lack of distribution. And Selway Meadows not only offers the opportunity to reintroduce west-slope cutthroat trout, but also to establish about 30 to 35 miles of connected habitat. And in so doing, we could also then potentially begin to conserve and restore pearl shell mussels. I'm trying to forward here. Okay. So what would it take to restore west-slope cutthroat trout? We started working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, worked on a lot of the details. It's complex because of the scope of the area. First of all, we needed to learn how to manage the water in the system, because removal of non-natives would require that we treat this probably chemically. And if we didn't have control of all of the water within the system, then there's an opportunity and an extreme likelihood that we just wouldn't get all the non-natives removed. So that required us to go in and begin to look at the infrastructure that was there and begin to upgrade it and make sure that we could control all water. We began that last year and replaced a number of diversions, removed some, and I think we probably have most of that handled. The next step is to construct a fish passage barrier that will prevent upstream movement of non-native fish. Then we'll have to remove non-native brook trout, brown and rainbow trout from 30 to 35 miles of stream above the barrier. And then the final step will be to reintroduce native West Slope cutthroat trout. So why the Good Neighbor Authority agreement for this? This project was complex, it's expensive, and it's really difficult to find things that allow you to get all the pieces in sync. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has their own priorities, and this is one of them, but they have others. And so one of the big things with Good Neighbor Authority is it allowed Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to enter this agreement with no required match. So even though the Forest Service had committed funds and we knew what we wanted to do, it's probably hard for state agencies, and can be, to know what's ahead and to commit the extent of funds for a project like this that may be necessary. So this just allowed us to, doesn't mean that the state won't add funds to the agreement, but allowed them a little more comfort in entering into it. It expanded our capacity to do the work. So Fish, Wildlife, and Parks contracted and guided the improvement of the irrigation infrastructure last year, the first step that was necessary to move ahead. They've also and are currently contracting barrier design for the work on the barrier, and they will contract the barrier construction. So, and finally, it provided an opportunity to work as partners in a different way. To achieve these objectives without Good Neighbor Authority, it might not have been possible. So I guess there's an overview of Selway Meadows. We're pretty fond of it, and there's some of the contact information. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I'm sure we'll have some questions from that. You can, if you have any, you feel free to go ahead and type them in. We'll get to them at the end. We'll have another session for questions on any of the presentations that you see. So my name is David Lawrence. I work in the Washington office in forest management staff, and I've been involved in implementation of the Good Neighbor Authority since late in 2014, primarily on the forest management, forest product side, but in some of the overall policy development that we've been working on. So in that time, we began implementing Good Neighbor Authority with the agreement templates at very late in fiscal year 2015. Late in 2015, we started implementing, fiscal year 15, we started implementing, and since that time, we have somewhere around 130-ish total agreements around the country. Many of those are master agreements that don't establish work, don't obligate anyone to specific projects, but establish the relationships between the Forest Service and state agencies. But nearly 100 of those are project agreements, and it's a broad range of activities: forest management activities, wildlife, hazardous fuels, threatened endangered species, invasive plants, lots of different things covered there. So we've seen a lot. We're starting to learn more as they get implemented. You know, it's one thing to get a bunch of agreements in place, but now as they're being implemented, we're starting to learn from that. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've learned in that time. And we'll start off with planning. As you, certainly the Forest Service folks here know that NEPA is part of everything we do. And I suspect that all the state employees, state agency folks that work with Forest Service are well aware of that as well. So that's a a compliance requirement that applies to all of our projects, whether the state does the work or whether the Forest Service does the work. And to this point, most of the projects have had the NEPA work completed prior to implementing the Good Neighbor project. But there are some cases that agreements have been developed to include state performance of some of that, some or all of the environmental analysis or associated requirements to implement Good Neighbor projects. But importantly, if that decision is made to take on some of the planning work by the state, as Lynn pointed out at the beginning, that the Forest Service retains the responsibility for the NEPA decision, and we cannot delegate that to the state. So that's always a Forest Service responsibility. Let's see, if we do incorporate planning into projects, we need to consider the implications of that in terms of the time frames and the costs and how those things will how they'll be completed and how they'll be paid for, and also to ensure that the planning they're doing is appropriate for them to implement as Good Neighbor projects. We wouldn't use the state, call on the state to do NEPA for for a campground construction project when building campgrounds is not an appropriate Good Neighbor activity. That said, if there are some incidental activities within a project analysis and project decision that aren't appropriate to do under Good Neighbor, those could still be included in planning work that the state may do, but the state wouldn't implement those activities. But if they're a small incidental amount of that overall project. Roads, we've had a little bit of discussion on this. Roads is always a hot topic. As Lynn said, the law prohibits the construction and reconstruction of permanent roads and is a little bit quiet otherwise. So we've interpreted that temporary road construction is allowable to the extent that it's necessary to implement projects. Road decommissioning is not a construction activity. It is a watershed restoration activity, and certainly not something we have any concerns about implementing under Good Neighbor authority. And as we talked about a little before, that some activities impacting roads that are for specific restoration objectives may be appropriate. We're working in a little bit of a gray area there, so it's important that we're really focused on the objectives of the project, as well as likely the extent of that project. If it's a discrete activity in a roadway that's for watershed restoration, that's one thing. If you're talking about replacing a series of culverts, that may be something different. So it's not something we have clear answers on, but certainly the objectives are an important a critical consideration there. Prescribed fire, one of the objectives is to reduce the accumulation of hazardous fuels under Good Neighbor. That said, that we have a number of ways to implement prescribed fire with state partners. So with Good Neighbor authority, it's most appropriate where the state will be doing the work or doing the work with the Forest Service, primarily to achieve restoration objectives. If it's such as a sage-grouse habitat or mule deer habitat improvement, something like that. If it's strictly a hazardous fuels reduction project, it might be more suited to implement under a cooperative fire agreement or a reciprocal fire protection. So that's something that we're working with the fire community to develop some more explicit guidelines for prescribed fire to make sure we use the right tool. So again, as Lynn said, consult with your grants and agreements staff early and often in these projects. Don't get too far down the road and then ask them and find out that you're using the wrong tool. Personnel, this is another tricky issue. Again, the objective is for the states to accomplish restoration work on the national forest land. It's not a hiring tool. It's not a workaround for Forest Service slow and sometimes slower than slow hiring processes. So we can fund state employees to do work on projects, but we're not hiring state employees to fill vacant Forest Service positions, even if those positions are doing restoration work. So they should be project-specific objectives. A couple examples here of what is appropriate under Good Neighbor, again, is, if we hire or work with the state to do some specific activities such as a stream restoration design, then we would reimburse the state for their employee costs. The same if they're working on something like a mine adit closure contract. The state issues the contract, the state does the administration of the contract, we would pay the expenses for that state employee. On the other side, we would not provide funding to the state in order for them to have maybe a receptionist that sells firewood permits or something like that may help achieve our restoration objectives, but it's not really a project-specific activity. It's more of a personnel action. Same, again, if you have a vacant Forest Service position, haven't been able to fill it, and think that we can plug somebody in there from the state for a while. It's really not the intent of this authority. Program income, Lynn talked about briefly, and it's kind of complicated and raises a lot of questions, so I won't get into it a whole lot here. As she said, it is generally a result of the sale of forest products by a state under Good Neighbor Agreement. So if, for example, a state agency prepares and sells a timber sale of national forest land, then the Forest Service collects an amount of money to meet the requirements of the National Forest Management Act. And if the state collects an amount above that all of that money is program income. So the program income has to be used within the project area for authorized restoration services under that agreement, including fish and wildlife habitat improvement. Lynn mentioned this before, I believe, but this might be something to think about in the context of the state that you're in and the organization or structure of your state agencies. If fish and wildlife and forestry are under a single Department of Natural Resources, or if they're housed separately, or how things work, that may think about that and coordinate with your state forestry counterparts in these projects to take that into consideration. If a state forestry project is going to generate a large amount of program income, there may be some fish and wildlife activities identified that would be well suited for the state fish and wildlife agencies to do. So it's something to think about how you would implement those with program income, how that would transfer across between the agencies to implement. If I don't know if both agencies would need to be part of the agreement, or if one is part of the agreement and they're able to just partner with their other agency and transfer funds and things like that. So just consideration. Next, with program income, is as the work that is done with program income. Again, it's part of the agreement. It's agreed to in advance between the state and the Forest Service, and it's included in the scope of work and the financial plan. These activities to be paid for with program income are part of the Forest Service timber sale appraisal. And again, I don't want to get in the weeds here, especially with a large audience that's not going to be as involved in the timber component, but It has to do with the National Forest Management Act requirements for the Forest Service to receive appraised value of the timber, and how we do that affects the potential for program income on a project. So the activities to be funded with program income should be identified to the extent possible in advance and included in that timber sale appraisal, so that program income is generated and it's legitimate activities to be funded with that program income. And a question that comes up often in a few situations anyway is, in a long-term perspective, if there is program income left over after a project, can it be moved to another agreement? And the answer to that is no, that program income is tied to the agreement under which it's generated and needs to be spent under that agreement. So to the extent that time allows within an agreement, you can certainly modify and update statements of work to add work activities and use that money. But it does have to be completed before the agreement expires. Program income is tracked and reported by the state partner, not by the Forest Service, and they provide the reports to the Forest Service on the SF 425. And as the projects evolve or are completed over time, the financial plans need to be updated on a regular basis to reflect the program income. So as sales are sold, as payments are received from timber purchasers and program income is generated, when these actual amounts are known more accurately, then the statements of work and financial plans are updated to reflect that available funding. I'll look at my notes there and make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Leatherwork. This is just coming back to Good Neighbor Authority just being one of multiple tools available for the Forest Service and the state to work together. Not every project that the Forest Service and the state may work on are suitable for Good Neighbor projects. So another reminder, work with your grants and agreement specialists on these. We've had instances where projects have been ready to be signed, only to find out that they weren't appropriate for Good Neighbor. We've had other projects that were actually executed and required being canceled and performed under a different agreement. And of course, there you risk losing obligated funds at that point. So don't want to get to that point. So some of the key elements or features of all Good Neighbor agreements, as Lynn mentioned, the compliance with federal financial assistance regulations at 2 CFR 200. This should be familiar to all the state partners. The agreements always provide principal contacts, and the agreement templates are kind of general there, with a couple of technical contacts and administrative contacts for the agreements. Certainly, the more detail is better. If you get into complex projects and have multiple technical contacts, those can be included as well. Provisions of the agreement. There are a lot of standard provisions that are included in the templates, including provisions for pre-agreement costs if they're approved, using reimbursable or advanced billing, things like that. So occasionally, as these agreements are developed, the state and the Forest Service may need to identify some non-standard provisions, and those can be negotiated with our grants and agreements policy group. So statement of work is one of the appendices of the agreement, and that of course describes what, where, when, how all the work will be completed, and the financial plan describes how that work will be funded. And then if it is a project that includes timber removal, there are a couple of additional appendices for the timber removal plan and a contract checklist. So the statement of work it provides your maps, your descriptions of the project area, what the activities are, what the outcomes are expected to be. Importantly, very importantly, agreed upon activities and who's doing those. So you want to describe the end result, who's responsible for what work the state's going to do, what role the Forest Service will have, to make sure those are clear. Restrictions and closures, any other compliance information that is required in order for the state to successfully carry out these activities. Again, I mentioned this briefly, that our existing laws and regulations, the federal laws and regulations, apply even when the state is doing the work. So if it's NEPA, if it's Forest Plan, if it's Endangered Species Act, if it's Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the National Forest Management Act with a couple of exceptions identified in the law, those things still apply even when the state is doing the work. So we need to make sure that we provide the state the information they need to do that work successfully. The financial plan corresponds to the activities in the statement of work, so we need to be sure that those things are well correlated. Indirect costs for the state are allowed using either the NCRA or a 10% de minimis rate. Program income, again, if that's anticipated or available from forest product or timber sale projects, that will be identified in the financial plan as a source of funding. And again, that program income is only used for activities within that project area and the agreement where it's generated. For timber projects, again, there's appendices D and E, and D is the timber removal plan, which outlines kind of your process for preparing and implementing the timber sale. And then the Appendix E, the timber sale checklist, is a checklist of items that need to be addressed in a state's timber sale contract. They're not required to use the Forest Service contract, but again, we have to ensure that federal laws and regulations are carried over into the state's contract to the extent that they apply to these activities. I do also want to note that this is collaborative work, between the state and the Forest Service, but also it's interdisciplinary work. So it's important that not just the timber sale contracting officer, timber sale administrator, or pre-sale forester are involved with the state here. It's important that other resource specialists from the Forest Service are involved as needed in both developing the statement of work and reviewing the contract. One of the lessons learned was something as seemingly simple as best management practices that were applied in a state contract, but on the ground, the BMP was the specification for the BMP was slightly different than the soil disturbance requirements for the forest, and the way they model for planning and the way they monitor for implementation was different, and so there was some incompatibility there, and it was discovered, during a contract. So those types of things are the reason that it's important that we include our interdisciplinary resource specialists in these reviews. So approaching the end here, a couple of key points to emphasize. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. That first and foremost is that Good Neighbor is driven by the state's capacity and desire to perform the work. It's, just because the Forest Service has more work than we can get done doesn't mean the state can do it, or is necessarily interested in doing it. So that's an important piece of the collaboration. The state really has to have the capacity and the desire to perform the work. By capacity, I don't mean they necessarily have to have all of the workforce in place. They have to have the capacity to do the contracting and administration if they don't do the work themselves. But either way, it gets to that same capacity need. As we said, the Forest Service does retain decision-making on NEPA decisions and also has responsibility for approving, preparing and or approving silvicultural prescriptions and marking guides for vegetation management activities. The statement of work is a collaborative product, again, developed jointly with the Forest Service and the state. And I can't emphasize enough, I think, how important it is to be as detailed as possible in the roles and responsibilities of both parties. One thing I've seen in some of the agreements is an Appendix F, which outlines operating procedures between the state and the Forest Service, and these may spell out things like what the response time is, turnaround time. If the state has done some work and they've asked for Forest Service concurrence, what is our responsibility and turnaround time? Or if it's a project with a timber sale, how are we going to manage payments? How often does the state make payments to the Forest Service? When do we bill? How long do we give the state to make those payments? Things like that. So same thing with any of the activities, what they are for preparation, administration, oversight, monitoring, any of those things. That the more detail you can put together up front, the better. And I would say that if you're developing an agreement and you feel like you're missing something, it certainly can't hurt to look at some examples of other projects in other states or within your state and see what they've done. So no reason to reinvent the wheel every time. A lot of that information is out there, and there are some good examples. Of course, the project, as we talked about, has to be an authorized restoration service as defined by the law for forest, watershed, and rangeland restoration activities. We have not finalized any policy at this point. We've been taking we'll call it an adaptive management approach right now, that we have some interim direction that's come out from the acquisition management and the forest management arenas to guide timber sale projects and the grants and agreements process. Both of those guidance documents are available internally on the Forest Service websites. I don't think we have them on external sites right now, but that information is available, and we're always looking for feedback and lessons learned to help us inform that as well as we can. We do anticipate moving towards finalization of handbook direction in both of those file codes, forest management, grants and agreements after the 2018 Farm Bill, and anticipation of possible changes with the Good Neighbor Agreement or Good Neighbor Authority in the next Farm Bill. Talk just a little bit about what master agreements were, that we can have master agreements in place that don't obligate projects, and then we would do a supplemental project agreement that is tiered to that. Those are popular. It looks great to say that the Forest Service and the state have a master agreement in place, but what really matters is the work being done. So a master may not always be the best tool, particularly if you look at longer term projects. Any of the supplemental projects have to be completed under the timeline of the master agreement. So if you get midway through a master agreement and you have a project that's going to take several years, you may not want to do a project under that master agreement. It may be better to use a standalone agreement. Again, as part of the agreement, you want to take into consideration planning, monitoring, and tracking of the activities, and some of those are especially critical for the forest products projects that include, that generate program income. That makes it much more complicated to keep track of. So these are collaborative efforts, and conclude here with this, that it is important as their learning processes and ongoing processes, that communication is open and frequent between the Forest Service and the state agency from the beginning to end, and between administrative roles and specialist roles all throughout. It's important to have good communication and to be committed as partners that you both have the best interest of the project in mind. You're working together as partners. You don't look at it as a Forest Service and a contractor relationship working together to get the work done. So just be clear on what the roles and responsibilities are, and keep those communications open. We recognize, as we've seen in some projects, that unexpected things do happen, and we realize that, and we understand that the best intentions are in place. So we work through those and make changes as we see fit. So with that, I'll move to the last project example, and this will be Cheryl Bryan, who's a fish and wildlife biologist on the National Forests in North Carolina. I believe she'll be joined by Brian McRae, the Land and Water Access Chief for North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, to talk about one of their projects.
So thank you, Dave. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of the great work happening in North Carolina. The fall of 2016 was a record-breaking wildfire season in much of the southeast, including western North Carolina, where the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forests are located. Much of this fire activity was on public land and required suppression activity at levels that we just aren't used to. Suppression efforts like the use of retardant and installation of miles and miles of wide dozer-created fire lines and some other containment tactics. And I don't mean to sound like we never use those things in the Southeast, but rather that this particular fire season ramped things up just a bit. There were dozens of wildfires burning simultaneously in the southern Appalachian Mountains at that time, which again is probably not outrageous for those of you joining us from the western U.S., but it was a whole new ballgame for suppression efforts in the southern Appalachians. We remain grateful for the unconditional support from dozens of crews from western national forests, national parks, and wildlife refuges, as well as state wildlife and forest resource agencies during these trying times. But probably that's another story for another day. Even with the tremendous help from some of the most skilled wildland firefighting staff in the world, access and suppression tactics were often limited by the steep mountainous terrain of western North Carolina, which had us putting our thinking caps on. There are close to 800 miles of linear wildlife openings on the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest, some of which are converted road prisms or even gated roads that are used infrequently for administrative use. These miles equate to roughly 1,400 acres of permanent grassy, herbaceous, and shrubby habitats utilized by a variety of wildlife species and are maintained cooperatively with the Wildlife Resources Commission on a 1 to 3 year cycle. This work, as is almost everything we do here in North Carolina, accomplished under either our Master Collection Agreement, Challenge Cost Share Agreement with the Wildlife Resources Commission, and probably still another story for another day. The condition of these linear wildlife openings varies across the forest, from more road-like, like is shown in this picture here, to more woods-like with larger, more dense vegetation. But after quite a bit of work to reduce fire fuels and exposed mineral soils. About 41 miles, or roughly 100 acres, of these openings became useful and successful fire breaks. So we've heard some folks talk about why Good Neighbor here and why now. Like I said, we do just about everything here in Western North Carolina in cooperation with our state partners. What made this project different? Perhaps the most important was the need for immediate restoration of the damaged wildlife habitat so that we didn't experience ripple effects down the road in terms of decreased turkey forage or rough grouse nesting success on already stressed populations. So immediately following the wildfire suppression, the National Forest in North Carolina rehabilitated the fire line services fairly quickly. We've heard already today that road work is not allowed under the Good Neighbor Authority, and even though these resources are linear wildlife openings, sometimes converted road prisms, we didn't really want to push that envelope. But really, the truth is, we lack the expertise and the capacity to restore these habitats in a timely manner. The Wildlife Resources Commission clearly has that expertise. They have an extremely effective workforce and a vested interest in restoring the damaged wildlife habitat on public land. In addition to that, we had recently signed a master Good Neighbor agreement with them that could easily be tiered to. So for this time and this place, the stars were lining. We learned a few things during this first Good Neighbor Authority project in Western North Carolina. Probably first and foremost that our partner agencies are fantastic and always willing to step up. I remember Dave just mentioning before that this is a collaborative effort and that everybody needs to be on board. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. Secondly, and perhaps the largest key to success is in the details, again, like Dave just mentioned to us. During project planning in this initiative, it became critically clear that we document every detail of the what, when, where, how, and who. But this doesn't mean we need to reinvent the wheel. Use of the required attachments to the agreement goes a long way. In fact, just the simple attachment A, statement of work, identifies what's going to be done, how it will be implemented, and what the estimated cost will be. They've also mentioned the importance of paying attention to those extra details, and in this example, there were a lot of extra details. The area, the burned area in Western North Carolina exhibits exemplary natural resource richness, as well as being located within the Trail of Tears corridor. So our particular Good Neighbor agreement also included specific directions on how to manage those natural resource and cultural aspects during project implementation. And even still, more details. Like I've mentioned several times already, the National Forest in North Carolina and the Wildlife Resources Commission have a rich tradition of working together. We're used to estimating project costs and contributions and agreement financial plans. And we learned a long time ago that the detail is important. Both the state and federal agencies are accountable to their constituents and are audited regularly. We know from experience that the truth is in the transparency here. And there was really no reason that our first Good Neighbor agreement should be any different, except for this project, we were also subject to the wildfire suppression accountability, and that required even more detail, especially in the documentation of the implementation costs. And I can only say for this, the commission really stepped up here. And I didn't show it here because the amount of detail would astound you that they included in their implementation documentation. They have literally accounted for every dollar it costs to restore these 100 acres of wildlife habitat. Because of these details, it's a when and not an if this project is audited by either agency. It'll be really easy to demonstrate that what, where, when, and how. I can't stress enough the importance of attention to these details during planning and implementation of projects under the Good Neighbor Authority. It's new and it's different, and we've learned some things today that make it just different enough for us to stop and think, maybe I better pay attention to some of those details. So perhaps maybe I'll just emphasize the most important detail of all is clear and consistent communication amongst the boots on the ground. You can rest assured that most of us here today can build agreements all day, but it's really what happens out there for the wildlife resources that is really important. And, you know, I have to say again that none of this is possible without mutual trust and respect and communication between all the parties involved, everywhere, all the time. And that extends to those boots on the ground, and in this case, those boots from the Nantahala Ranger District and the Franklin Wildlife Depots, because they are the ones that were ultimately responsible for all of the dirty, sweaty, difficult work of restoring wildlife habitat after these fires. Here in North Carolina, at least for now, the Good Neighbor Authority bar has been set pretty high. This project was planned and implemented with the highest degree of transparency possible. And this attention to detail, while arduous at first, has proven time and time again to be worth that extra effort. There's no doubt about what I mentioned at the beginning of this G&A example, that the key to success is in the details. We are lucky to have Brian McCrae here with us today, who is willing to share highlights of our story from the Wildlife Resources Commission perspective. So Brian, if you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cheryl. First off, just I guess would reiterate a number of things we've heard today about the details, and it's really the upfront details. You know, we're excited about doing this type of work. We want to increase the work on Forest Service lands. We want to improve the habitat on Forest Service lands, and for us to do that, this agreement really gives us a means to do that. But yes, it's the details and the upfront details. Cheryl mentioned, you know, we're used to estimating costs and project expenses, and so we do that, and we feel pretty confident with that. But as any other listener who's on the line who's working for a state agency knows, you know, we're tracking our time and mileage and expenses for our other federal aid purposes, and so those tools give us a very easy tool to apply here to track how we're implementing expenses for this specific project. And at the end of the day, we're just using those tools, submitting those invoices essentially to Cheryl, and we're getting a check back. It ends up being pretty simple. At the implementation phase, it is a little bit of work on the front end and getting the agreements all right and correct. I think maybe Cheryl and I were ready to pull our hair out a few different times when it came to getting lawyers involved. At least that's part of the game, but all for good reasons. And I think we ended up with a good product in the end, and really once it got implemented and again boots on the ground, it turned out to be a really good partnership, and we just got our feet wet a little bit with this one. Felt like this was low-hanging fruit and a good start for us, and I'm really pleased how it turned out, and look forward to working with the Forest Service again in the future on another project.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you to everyone for letting us share the strength of the partnership between the National Forest in North Carolina and the Wildlife Resources Commission. Please don't hesitate to contact any of us with your questions. We also do have Bonnie Amaral, our grants management specialist, on the line now. I don't know if she has anything to add now or would rather wait until the question phase. But the one detail I did forget to mention during the presentation is the attentiveness of your grants management specialist is probably the number one important detail in this process. Those are the folks that keep us on the straight and narrow. that hopefully keep us from unknowingly implementing projects that are not covered under this authority.
Yeah, this is Bonnie. I will say that I'm sure Brian and Cheryl at times we all have to deal with our agency-specific requirements, and so sometimes to marry those two agency requirements together is a long process. But I think in the end, both agencies were very satisfied. So I think it is key to take the time and have the patience to work through that. So I think everybody did a great job with that.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We'll turn it back over to Dave now.
Thank you, Cheryl, Brian, and Bonnie. That was a great example there. It was good to hear not just the work that was accomplished on the ground, but to get some of the details and understanding of what goes into getting the agreements in place. And then it was nice to hear that once it's in place and you're moving along, that you're already tracking those costs. You're used to tracking those costs for other federal aid purposes, and so it's really pretty straightforward and seamless there. So that was great to hear. Makes me feel good to hear sometimes things work a little more efficiently than you think they will. So now we can open it up to questions again. If you have questions, type them into the chat box. We'll respond to the questions there, and get Lynn back on the line. Anyone else that if questions are specific for them, maybe I'll start from the top here and see if we can work our way down back to filling positions. And this might be for Lynn to address the staffing questions. Do you mind, Lynn?
I don't mind a bit, David. So we've got three kind of related questions when it comes to staffing. And the first one says, can you use it to fund state positions? And then aside from filling behind a vacancy with a state employee, which is not allowed, what about a detailer from a state agency that could serve as a project coordinator? And then another question about if the state does not have the capacity, that is crews for pre-sale prep work, can you use Good Neighbor for job creation? So similar but different questions. So the first one, to fund a state position, the answer is no. You need to use Good Neighbor for restoration services. And so we're talking projects that accomplish something on the ground. We can pay for, if it takes a year to do this project and the Forest Service has the funding to fund that person to do this specific project, then yes, we could fund it. Could we just fund so somebody was available to us whenever we might need them? No. It needs to be tied to those restoration services. So filling behind where the Forest Service has a vacancy and filling behind with a state person. Now we've talked about this, says more specifically a project coordinator. So again, are we filling behind a Forest Service position, or are we paying a state employee to take care of this specific restoration project or group of projects? Keep in mind that we have the ability, not through Good Neighbor and not through our other agreements, but we have the ability to detail or hire in a state employee to work for the Forest Service under an Intergovernmental Personnel Act, or an IPA, and it's something that's done through Human Resources. It's a pretty good tool, and that's exactly what it's designed for, is to allow a state employee to come to work for the Forest Service. The Forest Service pays for it, and it's a great way to share between the agencies. And I can hear people going, yeah, but Good Neighbor is so much easier than an IPA, and that's not the reason we enter into the agreements. We pick the right tool for the right job, and that's what we've sort of been talking about all day here. So then the question about if a state doesn't have the capacity or the crews for sale prep, can we use Good Neighbor for job creation? Again, we're going to tie back to that restoration services. So let's say we have a thinning project that we want to do the restoration project, and it's thinning, and the state doesn't have the capacity. But what they do have the capacity for is to hire and direct and supervise a crew, and they can do that. And keep in mind it's the state's crew that's under their supervision, because remember, the state is serving as our agent in this. So they can't hire a crew that we would then, as a Forest Service, take over and manage and supervise and direct their work. But if we entered into an agreement with the state for a project, that would be an option for them to have their own crew. But it's not a job training, manpower development kind of thing. So keep in mind, if you need to do something with an employee, talk to your HR folks and ask about an IPA. So I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, Scott Spaulding asked, I think this was after the first session as well, objectives of the activity and fund code and road and fish passage example. Would NFWF, which is wildlife funds, have to fund that, or could another fund code per work finance principle be invoked as long as the objective is fish passage? So, you bring up a good point with the work finance principle. Of course, our budgeting and appropriations processes seem to be, I guess I'll say, evolving. I think this year, as I understand it, that there was even more of an expectation of, looking upon your pool of funds to meet the suite of restoration objectives with the two flagship targets, as your primary goals. So I know that in general, there's been a recognition of more flexibility in use of funds. So Good Neighbor agreements there aren't specific BLIs tied to the work funded in Good Neighbor, but again, we are still bound by appropriations law and whatever that requires of us to use the appropriate funds for the activity. And optics is another consideration there, that these agreements, particularly with Good Neighbor Authority being somewhat new, that audits are going to happen, and so the optics are important. If we're claiming that work is for fish and we're paying for a bunch of culverts with roads money or something like that, then that may not hold water to the auditors. So I'll say that the BLI is not critical there, but it still should be appropriate for the work being done and the objectives that you're achieving. All right, Matt has a question for Jim. If you're not muted, Jim, has Montana implemented fish barrier contracts in the past? Is this why they're taking the lead for the Meadow project?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, they have done a lot of barrier construction and contracting work in the past, but I also want to make sure, we didn't get it too deep into the details, but Fish, Wildlife, and Parks partnership on this project goes a lot deeper. So they have that experience in contracting. I think they've been effective in what they've done so far, but once the barrier's constructed, then they're doing MEPA, capital M MEPA for Montana Environmental Protection Act, to do the non-native removals and the fish reintroductions, and then we're doing the NEPA for the barrier construction on Forest Service land, and then we'll work jointly. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks will lead the non-native removal and reintroduction, but we'll be working shoulder to shoulder with them on that. So I didn't mean to imply that their expertise is just with contracting here, that they're leading this project on the fisheries side.
Thanks, Jim. If you see that second question, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah. So the second question is that what Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks brought to the table is their experience in designing or expertise in designing restoration actions. I think that what they bring to the table is first the authority to do the species work, the fisheries restoration, and they're very good at that. And what we've been able to do is just really mesh all of our priorities and objectives in a lot of areas besides Selway Meadows, but this one is one of the bigger ones.
Thanks. All right. The next question there from Ann Roberts: if the state does the NEPA, do they go through our process and time frames? The state's NEPA process is very different from ours. And hopefully Jim's information there on the state doing NEPA for the fishery introduction didn't confuse things, but the the activities performed on National Forest land under Good Neighbor are still federal actions, and they require federal NEPA to be completed. So it has to follow our guidelines under the Council of Environmental Quality and any of the regulations and procedures that entails. Let's see, next question. I thought program income can be used on a wider area. It has to be used within the project agreement where it's generated, and I guess we can describe wider area in that the agreements themselves can describe a broad area. Many of the project agreements that we have in place right now for vegetation management activities are at an entire national forest scale. So the statements of work can be modified over time and work added or modified to complete projects in different parts of the forest. So that would give you a wide area. It's just restricted to what is defined for that project agreement. Next, related to that, is how do those projects with program income get prioritized? And we don't have a national direction for that. That would be really part of the development of the agreement. On some of the forests, they've prioritized based on where they're starting out. If they're doing timber sales, so they want to ensure that they can do more timber sales. So that was their top priority. And after that, they want to do maybe work that the forest has had to forgo because of budget constraints. And then after that, they want to do their wish list items that have been on the nice to do list for a long time. And again, it is a collaborative process. So it's the state and the forest working together. So the forest may have some priorities or even specific projects that if it's not part of what the state has capacity and desire to do, that's certainly part of the negotiation for the agreement. And Clement's question, program income is the default in the agreements is that program income is additive to any other funding provided. So it is, unless it is changed when an agreement is implemented, that's the standard, is that program income adds to any funding, whether it's Forest Service funding or from another source. An alternative from that would be that if program income is realized, you would reduce federal funding, and that's not the default in the case of Good Neighbor. How does Wyden Amendment play a role in G&A? Lynn, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. We'll put this one and the next one together. And Anne had also asked, can program income be spent on state land if products were all harvested from NFS land. So this question has come up a lot. And so where we're at with this is that program income can be spent off NFS land if you include the Wyden authority within your Good Neighbor agreement, and you can demonstrate a benefit to those NFS lands, just like you would under Wyden, and those would have to be articulated within the agreement.
Lynn, do you want to, while you're on that one, look down at the very last question? If program income consists of Forest Service and state funding sources, can Forest Service employees work and or supervise work on adjacent state lands?
Well, program income would never consist of both Forest Service and state funding sources. Program income is its own beast. You know, it's generated from the sale of federal timber, but it's held and accounted for and expended by the state on projects that are jointly agreed to by the state and the Forest Service. So Good Neighbor does not authorize Forest Service performance of work. What Good Neighbor authorizes is the state to do work on National Forest System land. So if you're looking at Forest Service employees working off National Forest System land, you have to look at a different instrument. We did have a question earlier, not in this session, but so the state has all of this program income, and people wondered, well, could we enter into a collection agreement with the state for them to pay for Forest Service employees to do some of the work that's been described in the agreement? And the answer is no. It's not an appropriate use of the program income. So a couple of very separate activities. Again, just one tool in the toolbox.
Thanks, Lynn. Rick Dillard asks, should separate supplemental project agreements be developed to implement different projects with the same state agency? And I would answer that with it depends, and that's because of the potential for program income. If you're working on projects that will generate program income and have some potential to generate funds over a long time period, it may be desirable to modify your statement of work over time and add projects to that agreement. If you are providing, Forest Service and or the state are providing funding for an explicit site-specific project, I would suggest that they're kept separate because it will make them more easily accountable. Lynn, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I will. It's not always easier to keep adding projects onto one agreement. Often it's much easier to do separate agreements or supplemental project agreements for these different projects for tracking and accounting and for accomplishment. You know, you don't want to have to do a 40-page report to cover 27 projects when you can do a one-page report for each one of them. So keep in mind that sometimes a separate agreement really is a better and more efficient way to go.
Thanks. All right. Gerald Lawrence asks how G&A and stewardship compare, and when would you use one over the other? So the end results can be very similar, if not identical. Some of the key differences are who is your partner. If it is not the state, then Good Neighbor is not an option. If it is the state, you look at how the work will be done, and if it's a stewardship agreement, there's a slightly different role there for the state and Forest Service relationship, and the stewardship agreements require a match from the state, and these are supposed to be mutual. The stewardship agreements are mutual interest and mutual benefit projects. If there's really not a, there's not a requirement, I guess, to have that mutual interest relationship under the Good Neighbor Authority, nor is it necessary for them to provide a match. So that's one difference. The other would be also how the timber is, if you're including forest products, timber disposal with it, would be that method of disposal. If it's Good Neighbor Authority, the state will sell that timber using a state contract, and if it's a stewardship agreement, then the Forest Service has put together all of the disposal requirements in that stewardship agreement to specify what the requirements are at that point. So slightly different there as well, but the end results are the same. And the last question I see, I think this was a question for Cheryl or someone on the North Carolina project. Was the project work funded with bear money or a combination of other funds?
So this is Cheryl. I'm not sure. I've been messaging with Bonnie. I'm not sure if she's still on the line or not. She's actually in a training session this week. So I'm going to attempt to answer this, but we may need to have follow-up with better clarification. So it is my understanding that this project was funded through the closeout of the fire suppression activities. And so I know there were 6 or 7 fund codes that were charged for this. But again, I'm not a fiscal manager, so I don't claim to understand all the details. And feel free to message me, call me, or Bonnie Amaral, actually. She's our fiscal contact for this one.
All right, thanks, Cheryl. All right, I think that gets all of the questions in the chat box, so we appreciate everybody's questions and hope we've answered them to your satisfaction. So this slide here has some contacts for Forest Service and Association of Fish and Wildlife. Sorry. Yeah.
You got it. Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Yep.
Always wrestle with that one. All right. So, Chris, you wanna button us up here?
I will. We're coming to the end of our time. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the presenters for pulling this information together and sharing it. Thank you to the participants. We really appreciate you joining us. And I want to say thank you to everyone for your patience as we work through the audio issues there. I think I now understand how this works, and I can do better next time. We obviously don't have contact information for everybody that's involved, but we'd be glad to connect you with individual people. And Devin DeMario and Andrew Schmidt at AFWA are, good contacts for the state. I'm available in my role as the liaison between the Forest Service and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I have been frantically typing in the background, sending out the slide deck to everybody who popped up and had requested it in the chat box. If you want a copy, feel free to grab my email down at the bottom of the slide, send me a quick note, and I'll just reply back and send you the slide deck. The point of this was to share what Good Neighbor Authority is and how we can come together and work on some projects, especially as you use your thought process around shared conservation goals, forest, rangeland, watershed, restoration services. There's just a lot of potential here. It's really exciting stuff. I know it takes a little bit of time to get it set up and going, but once you're off and rolling, there's some amazing things that can get done. So with that, thank you one and all, and this concludes our call.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.